Have you ever felt the silence before a storm? Not a storm of wind and rain, but the storm that's about to rip your life apart. I was in the eye of that storm, in my family's law office, a place that always smelled of polished oak, old money, and well-kept secrets. Rain was pouring down outside the window, but inside, the air was even colder. My father, Richard Vance, sat ramrod straight in a leather armchair, his expression terrifyingly calm. My mother, Caroline, gently squeezed my sister Savannah's hand. They both shared a private smile, the kind reserved only for each other, the smile of people who know they are about to win. Savannah, the family's perfect star, a social media queen with millions of followers, looked as if she were waiting for the finale of a movie she'd already seen. And me, I'm Eliza, the outsider sitting on the edge of the perfect family portrait, a discordant note. They looked at me, but they didn't really see me. Their gazes slid past me as if I were part of the furniture, a faint shadow not worth their attention. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, a man who had seen 3 generations of the Vance family, cleared his throat. He held the will, and I could feel the weight of every word through the thick paper. He skimmed through the smaller assets, the charitable donations, and then he got to the main event. "To my daughter, Savannah Vance," he read, "who has always been the light and joy of this family. I leave the trust fund valued at $5 million and the penthouse in downtown Seattle." My mother beamed. Savannah gave a slight nod, a gesture of well-practiced grace. Everything was going according to plan. Their plan. And then Mr. Harrison turned to another page, a page they clearly hadn't expected. The silence in the room stretched taut. He looked directly at me, and for the first time that afternoon, I no longer felt invisible. And finally, to my brilliant granddaughter, Eliza Vance, whose soul is as deep as the ocean she loves. I leave the entire Vance Institute of Oceanography, including all patents, endowment funds, and intellectual property. Savannah didn't cry. She didn't even look stunned. She screamed. But that wasn't the worst part. That scream was just the beginning. The worst part came right after, when an old oak box was placed on the table, locking away a secret even bigger than my grandfather's fortune. A secret that would unravel every lie, every calculated smear campaign, and expose the true face behind my perfect family. This isn't just a story about an inheritance. This is a story of a forgotten promise, a sophisticated years-long deception, and the journey of the girl who was cast aside to reclaim not just her legacy, but her very soul. And it all started with a tiny key I'd worn around my neck since I was a child. Savannah's scream hung in the air and then shattered, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. It was thick with astonishment and simmering rage. My father, Richard, was the first to break it. He shot to his feet, the expensive leather chair groaning in protest. His face, usually as calm as a god delivering judgment, was now flushed, veins standing out on his temples. "Harrison, what is the meaning of this?" His voice was low and threatening. "There must be a mistake. The Institute is the core legacy of the Vance family. It requires leadership, connections, not a plaything for a child who just tinkers with seashells." My mother, Caroline, ever the picture of perfection, was now white as a sheet, her lips pressed tight to keep them from trembling. She looked at me, and in a fleeting moment, I didn't see anger. I saw panic. It was the look of someone whose plan had just been spectacularly derailed. Mr. Harrison was unruffled. He was as calm as a still lake. "There's no mistake, Richard," he said, his voice even. "This will was validated multiple times. Arthur's wishes were crystal clear." Then he did something no one expected. He bent down and lifted an old oak box from his briefcase, carved with images of waves and sea creatures. It wasn't large, but it looked incredibly heavy, as if it contained a lifetime. He placed it on the table with a decisive thud. "Furthermore," he continued, "Arthur had one final request. He left this box for Eliza. However, there's a condition. It can only be opened in the presence of his mother, Mrs. Eleanor Vance." Another silence fell. Eleanor, my grandmother. The woman who had isolated herself in her coastal home since my grandfather's death, refusing all visitors. Forcing us to go to her was like a calculated chess move from beyond the grave. My father looked like he wanted to protest, but he knew his own father's rules. Arthur's wishes, however absurd, were absolute. The drive to her house on Whidbey Island was the most stressful trip of my life. No one spoke a word, but the air in the luxury car was thick with unspoken accusations. Savannah was huddled in the corner, silent tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of rage, of a child whose favorite toy had just been taken away. My parents sat in the front, silent as stone statues. I stared out the window, leaving the Seattle skyline behind for the dark pine forests and rocky shores of Puget Sound. There, the wind always carried the salt of the sea and old secrets. Eleanor's house was perched on a cliff overlooking the strait. Built of wood and stone, weathered by rain and sea salt, it looked as if it had grown from the land itself. As we entered, the smell of damp wood, old books, and dried lavender wafted over us. She was waiting in the living room, sitting by a cold fireplace. She was thinner than I remembered, her silver hair in a neat bun, and her blue eyes, exactly like my grandfather's, regarded us with a cool distance. She nodded at my parents and Savannah. Then her gaze landed on me. "Eliza," she said, her voice as dry as autumn leaves. "I thought you were too busy with your glamorous life in California to be bothered with a dying grandfather." I froze. My throat tightened. "Grandma, that's not true," I stammered. "I tried." "Tried?" She cut me off, a faint, cynical smile on her lips. She stood, walked to a small cabinet, and pulled out a sheaf of papers. She threw it on the table in front of me. "Is this you, trying?" I looked down. They were color printouts from an Instagram account. The handle was Eli Vance Adventures. And on it were pictures of a girl who looked vaguely like me, but wasn't me. A girl raising a champagne flute on a yacht, posing in chic nightclubs, shopping in expensive boutiques. Beneath each photo were vapid captions, "Too busy living my best life to look back." Or, "Family, who needs it when you have the world?" A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't me. It was an elaborate fabrication, a puppet created for a single purpose, to make me look like an ungrateful, shallow brat in the eyes of the one remaining relative who might have taken my side. I looked up and saw the almost imperceptible smirk on Savannah's face, and I understood everything. "This isn't mine," I said, my voice trembling but firm. I pulled out my own phone, opening my texts and call logs. "This is dozens of texts to my grandfather that were never answered. Hundreds of calls to a number I now know was never his." I held the phone out to her. She squinted at the screen, reading my desperate messages. Grandpa, I miss you. Grandpa, Mom and Dad said you don't want to see me. Is that true? Grandpa, I love you. Her stony expression seemed to crack just a little. The certainty in her eyes began to waver. Just then, my gaze fell on the oak box Mr. Harrison had placed on the coffee table. I looked at the intricate carvings, and then I noticed a tiny detail I'd missed before. A tiny brass lock, almost hidden in the wave pattern. And then, a memory sparked. My heart hammered. I unconsciously raised a hand to my neck, touching the silver chain my grandfather had given me for my 10th birthday. The pendant was a tiny, antique silver key. All my life, I'd thought it was just a piece of jewelry. But now I suddenly understood. It was never just a piece of jewelry. It was the key to the truth. My hand trembled as I unclasped the chain from my neck. The small, cold silver key rested in my palm. For so many years, it had been a silent reminder of my grandfather, of the only person in the family who had ever looked at me like I was a star, not a shadow. Now, it might be the answer. I walked to the coffee table, feeling everyone's eyes on me. My father crossed his arms, a skeptical smirk on his face. My mother looked anxious, glancing at Savannah, whose face was now drained of all color. Savannah wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the box, as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. My grandmother, Eleanor, just watched silently. Her cold gaze had softened, replaced by a cautious curiosity. I knelt before the table, taking a deep breath to steady myself. My clumsy fingers guided the key into the tiny brass lock. A soft click sounded, sharp in the quiet room. It was a perfect fit. My heart seemed to stop. I slowly turned the key. Another click sounded as the internal mechanism released. I placed my hand on the lid, hesitated for a second, then gently lifted it. The room held its breath. My father leaned forward, clearly expecting to see stock certificates, property deeds, or even gold bars. Savannah craned her neck, her greedy eyes unconcealed. But the box contained none of those things. No jewels, no money. Inside, there were only old leather-bound journals, nestled neatly side by side. There were 6 or 7 of them, the leather worn and faded with age, the paper yellowed. On the spine of each, numbers were carefully hand-etched. 1998, 2020. A wave of disappointment washed over my father's and sister's faces. "It's just some old notebooks," Savannah muttered, her voice laced with contempt. But I knew, and I think my grandmother knew too, that this was the real treasure. Mr. Harrison, the lawyer, put on his reading glasses, his voice full of reverence. Arthur instructed me that if the box was opened, I was to read the marked passages from the final journal. He carefully lifted the top journal, opening it to a page marked with a sea blue ribbon. He cleared his throat and began to read. His voice was steady, but my grandfather's words came to life, filling the room. June 14th, Mr. Harrison read. Richard and Caroline complained about Eliza again today. They say she's too quiet, too distant, always has her nose in a book, or one of her strange experiments. They worry she'll never fit in. I tried to explain to them that a mind like Eliza's isn't meant to fit in. It's meant to stand out. But they don't listen. They only see what they want to see. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. My grandmother reached out and gently took my hand. Mr. Harrison continued. August 22nd. Savannah won another beauty pageant. The whole family celebrated. Her picture was hung prominently in the living room. That same day, Eliza won the state science fair for her project on seawater filtration. When she showed Caroline, her mother just said, "That's nice, dear," and went back to picking out a frame for Savannah. That night, I saw Eliza hide her trophy under her bed. It broke my heart. A choked sob escaped my throat. I remembered that day perfectly, the hot shame I'd felt as if my intelligence were a crime. And then, Mr. Harrison said, his voice dropping, "There's this entry." He turned the page. November 5th. 12-year-old Eliza gave me a napkin she'd doodled on during dinner tonight. She called it a wave-powered generator. Richard laughed at her, told her not to waste her time on fantasies. I asked her for the napkin. I didn't see childish nonsense. I saw a vision. I saw the future. I'm going to keep it. One day, the world will have to recognize her talent, even if her own family is blind to it. With that, Mr. Harrison carefully reached between the pages and pulled something out. An old, yellowed napkin, folded in 4. He gently unfolded it and placed it on the table. On it, in a child's clumsy pencil strokes, was unmistakably a diagram, with arrows showing water flow, drawings of turbines, and tiny, scrawled notes. It was proof, tangible proof of his love and belief. Incontrovertible proof of the truth I had always known deep in my heart. "Ridiculous!" Savannah suddenly shrieked, her composure shattering. "This is just the rambling of a senile old man. You promised me. Mom and Dad promised me." She lunged for the table, trying to grab the journals, but this time, I didn't flinch. I stood up, a beat faster than her, placing my hand protectively over the journals. I looked my sister dead in the eye, her own blue eyes now wild with panic and envy. "You can act your whole life," I said, my voice not loud, but steady and sharp as a blade. "You can create fake accounts and tell lies, but you can't fake this." I pointed to the napkin. "This is understanding. This is love. It's something you'll never have, because you've never truly given it." My words hung in the air, sharp and irrefutable. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to shrink back after speaking the truth. I stood my ground, firm as a lighthouse against the storm I knew was about to hit. And the storm came. Savannah's face twisted with rage. Her initial panic was quickly replaced by the indignation of someone who is used to getting her way and isn't. "I don't know what you're talking about," she hissed, turning to my parents for backup. "Look, Mother, she's trying to make me the villain. After everything I've done for this family, for Grandpa. She disappears for years and now comes back to ruin everything." My father stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Savannah's shoulder. He looked at me with eyes as cold as ice. "That's enough, Eliza. This charade ends here. You've been given a gift far beyond what you deserve. Be grateful and be quiet." "A gift?" I laughed, a humorless sound. "You call neglect, lies, and the deliberate erasure of your own daughter's existence a gift. Don't be insolent!" my father roared, pointing a finger in my face. "You have no right to judge us." "Silence!" a voice boomed, not loud but full of authority, cutting through the chaos. It was Eleanor. My grandmother had risen to her feet. She stood tall, and though she was small in stature, she radiated an incredible power. She slowly walked to the center of the room, and as if by an invisible force, all eyes were drawn to her. The argument died. She didn't look at me. She looked directly at her son, Richard. "Richard," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "You say she has no right to judge. Then who gave you the right to judge her talent as a fantasy? Who gave you the right to decide that your father's love for her was a charade?" My father was stunned, his mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. She turned to my mother, Caroline, who was cowering behind her husband. "And you, Caroline, you always prided yourself on your refinement, on managing a perfect family, but you were blind to your own daughter's pain. You enabled the lies because a sparkling daughter like Savannah is easier to show off than a brilliant one, isn't she?" My mother stared at the floor, unable to look up. Finally, she turned to Savannah, who looked at her in disbelief. "And you, Savannah," she said, a note of sadness in her voice. "You're beautiful, you're charming, you know how to please people. But you turned those gifts into tools for your own selfishness. You treated your grandfather's love like an investment, and you're angry it didn't yield the return you expected." "A love is not a transaction, my dear." She fell silent for a long moment. It felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. She slowly turned to look at me, and in her blue eyes, I saw regret and a newfound respect. She said nothing to me, but that look said everything. She took a deep breath, then delivered her final verdict, clear and absolute. "All of you," she said, her eyes sweeping over my father, mother, and sister. "Get out of my house, now!" "Mother!" my father exclaimed, his voice full of shock. "You can't do this!" "I can, and I will," she replied, without a flicker of hesitation. "I have allowed these lies to fester in this house for too long. I believed you when you said Eliza didn't care. That was my mistake, but that mistake ends today. Go!" Silence reigned. Her words had the weight of an unmovable stone. Savannah was the first to act. She grabbed her purse, shot me one last venomous look, and stormed out the door, the click of her heels on the wood floor like gunshots. My mother, in tears of humiliation, hurried after her. My father was the last to leave. He paused in the doorway, turning back to look at me. His expression was no longer one of hot anger, but of cold, calculated hatred. "You may have won today, Eliza," he said, his voice a hiss. "You may have the building and your dusty old notebooks, but I will make sure you never get a single dollar of funding. I will use every connection I have, every bit of my influence in this city, to turn that place into a ruin. Good luck with your legacy." With that, he turned and slammed the door. The door shut, and this time the silence was completely different. It wasn't suffocating, it was empty. And in that emptiness, I felt two things at once: the immense relief of someone just set free, and a chill as I realized my war had only just begun. The door slammed shut, its final thud punctuating the end of a long, painful chapter of my life. Silence fell, but this time it wasn't empty or suffocating. It was vast, expansive, and in a way, peaceful. My father's threat still echoed in my ears, cold and sharp, but it had lost its power. It was merely the growl of an animal driven from its territory. I stood motionless in the middle of the room, the breath I didn't realize I had been holding slowly releasing. My whole body was shaking, not from fear, but from the release of a pressure that had been crushing me for 26 years. Eleanor walked over, her thin but steady hands resting gently on my shoulders. "It's over, my girl," she said softly. "It's all over." I turned to look at her, and finally, the The tears I had held back all day began to fall. But these weren't tears of self-pity or pain. They were tears of release. I hugged her, burying my face in her thin shoulder like a child, and for the first time in years, I felt it. I felt like I was home. That night, I didn't go back to Seattle. My grandmother insisted I stay, and I didn't want to leave. She showed me to my old room in the attic, a room I hadn't set foot in for nearly a decade. Everything was the same. The glow-in-the-dark stars my grandfather had helped me stick to the ceiling were still there, arranged in the exact patterns of the Big Dipper and Canis Major. The wallpaper with its faded spaceships, the bed with its slightly lumpy mattress felt strangely familiar. That evening, she made me a cup of chamomile tea. We sat by the fireplace, which was now lit, its warm, dancing light illuminating the lines on her face. We didn't talk much about what had happened. The pain was still too raw. Instead, she told me stories about my grandfather, about how they first met, how he'd clumsily proposed with a diagram drawn in the sand, about his endless love for the sea and its mysteries. And then, she said something that stunned me. "Walter started planning the Institute 5 years ago, Eliza," she said thoughtfully, "long before he got sick." I looked up at her, amazed. 5 years ago? But why? She looked deep into my eyes, and in the flickering firelight, I saw a profound understanding. Because he saw this day coming. He saw his son becoming more and more obsessed with money and status. He saw his daughter-in-law drowning in superficial values, and he saw you, a brilliant mind being slowly extinguished by the very people who should have been nurturing it. She paused, taking a sip of her tea. He wanted to create a refuge for you, a sanctuary, a place where you could be yourself, create freely without asking permission, without being judged. That institute isn't an inheritance, Eliza. It's a lifeboat he spent years building for you. Her words were like an electric current running through me. His legacy wasn't a last-minute decision. It was a calculated act of love years in the making. He hadn't just left me a future. He had tried to save me from my past. The next morning, I woke as the first rays of dawn streamed through the window, painting long stripes of light on the wooden floor. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel the weight of having to prove myself. The fresh sea air filled my lungs, bringing with it a sense of clarity and newness. I went down to the kitchen, made a pot of coffee, and brought it out to the back porch where my grandmother was reading the newspaper. She smiled at me, a warm smile with no trace of distance. "So, what now, scientist?" she asked, folding the paper. I looked out at the sea. The white-capped waves were still tirelessly crashing against the cliffs, an endless symphony of persistence and power. My father's threat echoed in my head again, but this time, it didn't scare me. It only strengthened my resolve. "Now," I said, my voice steadier than it had ever been, "I think it's time I go see my new home." The road to the Vance Institute of Oceanography wasn't a grand boulevard. It was a small, unmarked dirt road, turning off the coastal highway and hidden among towering pines and cedar trees. Without the map Mr. Harrison had given me, I probably would have never found it. The seclusion was clearly intentional. This was a place built for isolation, for focus, to escape the judgment of the outside world. My grandmother had wanted to come, but I gently refused. This was a journey I had to make alone. As I drove slowly down the dirt road, gravel crunching under the tires, my heart beat faster. I didn't know what to expect. A cold concrete building, a sterile abandoned lab. My father's threat was still a dark cloud hanging over me, And part of me feared this place was just an empty shell, a dream never completed. And then I saw it. Tucked into a quiet, cliff-protected cove, the building appeared. But it was nothing like I had imagined. It wasn't a modern block of glass and steel. It looked more like a large converted boathouse or an old cannery, with dark cedar walls weathered by sun and wind, a tin roof, and a pair of massive wooden front doors that looked like they belonged on a century-old barn. It was rustic, unassuming, and somehow it was deeply infused with the spirit of my grandfather, a man who always found beauty in simplicity and strength in things built to last. I parked the car, got out, and took a deep breath of the salty sea air, the gentle lapping of waves on the nearby shore, the cry of gulls overhead. For a moment, I just stood there, looking at the building. It didn't seem derelict at all. On the contrary, it had a quiet vitality, as if it had been patiently waiting. I walked up to the large wooden doors and used the key Mr. Harrison had given me. The lock turned with a solid thunk, and I put my shoulder into it, pushing one side open. The heavy door creaked open, and a flood of light poured out, making me squint. As my eyes adjusted, I stepped inside, and my breath caught in my chest. If the outside was 19th century rustic, the inside was a 22nd century world. The interior was a single, massive, high-ceilinged hall. The entire eastern wall facing the sea had been replaced with floor-to-ceiling panes of glass, allowing the morning light and the view of the blue ocean to fill the space. The polished concrete floor reflected the light like water. The air was clean, smelling of stainless steel, new equipment, and a faint hint of sea salt. Rows of stainless steel lab benches were neatly arranged. On them sat equipment I had only dreamed of using: an electron microscope, high-speed centrifuges, a spectrometer, and an industrial 3D printer still in its plastic wrap. Along the walls were towering shelves, but instead of books, they held dozens of carefully sealed cardboard boxes, and all labeled in a neat, familiar handwriting. For Eliza. Tears blurred my vision again. He hadn't just left me a building. He had equipped me with an arsenal. He had given me every tool I would need to fight the coming war. I walked in amazement, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the vast space. I ran my hand over the cold steel countertop, staring at the still dark computer monitors. This wasn't a dream. This was real. And then, in the very center of the room, I saw it. A large maple wood desk, older and more personal than everything else. And on its surface, there was only one object. It wasn't a computer or a piece of equipment. It was a small, worn notebook, its corners curled. It was my childhood notebook, the one I thought I had lost long ago, the one with yellowed pages and the scrawled handwriting of an 8-year-old, documenting my observations of the creatures in the tide pools. My knees felt weak. I walked to the desk like a sleepwalker and tremblingly picked up the notebook. I flipped through the pages, seeing my clumsy drawings of starfish and sea anemones, my notes on the cycles of the tides. He had kept it. All these years, he had kept it. He hadn't just built me a lab. He had built me a home for my mind, a sanctuary for my childhood dreams. I clutched the notebook to my chest, and this time, I didn't cry. A sense of peace and an intense strength spread through me. My father's threat was now just a distant, meaningless echo. How could he destroy something built with such pure and solid love? Standing in the middle of his legacy, amidst the tangible proof of his faith in me, I made a vow. I would not let this place become a ruin. I would turn it into a beacon of knowledge and hope, a beacon so bright that no darkness could ever touch it. The first few weeks at the Institute passed in a hazy dream, fueled by coffee, adrenaline, and a profound sense of responsibility. By day, I spent my time on a seemingly simple but essential task: discovery. I opened every box labeled "For Eliza." Inside were not just state-of-the-art instruments, but classic oceanography textbooks, first editions of research papers I admired, and his handwritten notes tucked inside each one, with lines like, "Pay attention to this chapter, you'll find it interesting," or "This theory is outdated, but its core idea is not." Every small discovery felt like a conversation across time with him. I could feel his presence in every corner of this building, in the way the morning sun lit up the main lab, in the constant murmur of the waves outside the window. I worked alone, but I never felt lonely. I was in a space built with love, and that gave me a strength. But love can't pay the bills. And my father's threat was not an empty one. As I began to set up the Institute's operations, the invisible wall he had built became apparent. I contacted familiar equipment suppliers to order chemicals and consumables. Companies that once replied to my emails within hours now went silent for a week. My calls were repeatedly sent to voicemail. I tried applying for research grants from major foundations, places where the Institute's profile and facilities should have put me at the top of the list. Time after time, I received cold, politely worded rejection emails. "Your profile is very impressive, but we have decided to pursue other directions at this time." The harshest truth came from a call with Dr. Albright, my old university professor and a friend of my grandfather's. "Eliza," he said, his voice heavy. "I'm so sorry. Your father's name, Richard Vance, carries a lot of weight on boards and grant committees. I've heard the whispers. He's made it clear that anyone who works with your project will find difficulties with their own future projects." After hanging up, I sat silently in my office, looking out at the vast ocean. My father didn't just want me to fail. He wanted to isolate me, to suffocate my dream before it could even take flight. A sense of helplessness began to creep in. How could I, alone, fight against a network of power and influence built over decades? I picked up my childhood notebook and flipped to the drawing of the wave-powered generator. The drawing was naive, but the idea wasn't. And then, a thought sparked. Maybe I was going about this all wrong. I had been trying to play their game, on their field. Maybe it was time to create my own. I couldn't do this alone. I needed allies, but not people who cared about politics or money. I needed people who believed in science, who shared the same passion and weren't afraid of a fight. I immediately thought of two people. The first was Tara Chen, a friend from my graduate program. Tara was a data and modeling genius, a logical mind who could see patterns in chaos. She was fed up with the rigid corporate environment at a major biotech firm, where creativity was always stifled by bureaucracy. The second was Micah Jones. Micah was a field biologist, a man with muddy hands and feet that weren't afraid of water. He had a fierce love for coastal ecosystems and was always furious at the indifference of large corporations toward the environment. I called them. I didn't promise them high salaries or a secure future. I told them the truth about the Institute, about my grandfather's legacy, and about the war I was facing. I just showed them my vision, an independent, agile research center where science was done for the good of the community and the planet, not for profit. I invited them to visit the Institute. When Tara saw the server room and the data analysis equipment, her eyes lit up. When Micah saw the pristine cove and the potential for field research, he couldn't hide his excitement. That night, the three of us sat around the maple desk, the very one where I had found my notebook. "The big foundations have shut us out," I said plainly. "My father's influence is too strong." Tara was typing away on her laptop. "Then we don't go to them. There are hundreds of smaller grants from community organizations, local conservation funds, clean energy innovation programs. They're outside his sphere of influence." Micah pointed to my notebook, which I'd left open to the page with the crude design. "We start here," he said, his voice full of passion. "A small project with a big impact. A wave-powered generator to power the Institute itself and maybe a few homes in the community. It's concrete, it's useful, and it's a great story to tell." Looking at them, at the determination and hope in their eyes, I knew I was no longer alone. My father might have money and power, but I had something more valuable. I had a legacy built on love, a clear vision, and now I had a team. The fight was still ahead, but for the first time, I felt ready for it. The following months were a series of long days and even longer nights. The Institute, once a quiet and solemn space, transformed into a busy hive. The whiteboard in the main conference room was now covered in complex formulas, technical drawings, and scribbled notes. The smell of strong coffee mixed with machine oil and the salty sea air. We had a team. We had a plan. Now it was time to make it real. We named our first project Project Wavewing, inspired by the shape of the turbine design I had drawn on that napkin years ago. Our goal was modest yet ambitious: to build a prototype wave-powered generator powerful enough to light up the entire Institute. The work was grueling. Tara buried herself in code and computer simulations, calculating fluid dynamics and optimizing every angle of the turbine blades to capture the most energy from each wave. Micah, in contrast, was the man in the field. He spent weeks diving in the cove, measuring current strengths, analyzing the seabed topography, and selecting the perfect spot to install the prototype. As for me, I was the bridge between them, trying to translate Tara's complex theoretical models into practical mechanical instructions, while getting my hands greasy with Micah in the fabrication workshop. We used most of my remaining savings to build the first prototype. It was crude and ugly, a mishmash of recycled steel, fiberglass, and electronic chips, but we loved it. The first test day was a disaster. We launched Wavewing 1.0 on a calm afternoon. It bobbed on the water, and then when the first real wave hit, one of the main joints snapped. The whole structure let out a horrifying screech and then sank into the cold waters of the cove. That evening, none of us said a word. We sat in the dark lab, looking out at the placid sea that seemed to be mocking our efforts. Failure tasted bitter. My father's threats echoed in my mind. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was just a fantasy. But then Tara spoke, breaking the silence. "The joint failed at 4.2 kilonewtons of stress," she said, her eyes still glued to her laptop. "My model predicted 4.5. It's an acceptable margin of error. I know how to fix it." Micah nodded. "And the location was too shallow. The surface current was too strong. We need to take it further out, deeper." Looking at them, my despair slowly evaporated, replaced by a new resolve. Failure wasn't the end. It was just a data point. We spent another 2 months working almost without sleep to build version 2.0. It was stronger, smarter, and placed in a more carefully calculated position. And then the fateful night came. A small storm was moving in from the sea, perfect conditions for a test. The wind howled outside, and rain lashed against the giant glass panes. Inside, the three of us stood before a large monitor, tracking the data being transmitted from WaveWing 2.0. A single light bulb, wired directly to the system, hung in the middle of the room. We waited. Each large wave crashed ashore, and on the screen, the energy meter spiked and then fell. My heart pounded with every wave, and then the bulb flickered once, twice. Then it blazed to life, a steady, warm yellow light banishing the darkness in the lab. We had done it. We had created light from the sea. Our cheers mingled with the roar of the storm outside. It was a moment of pure joy, the sweetest victory I had ever tasted. Our small success did not go unnoticed by the local community. An old fisherman had seen the strange light from the institute during the storm and told the story in town. A local newspaper came to write an article, and that article helped us get our first grant, a modest sum from the County Sustainable Development Fund. It wasn't much, but it was recognition. It was proof that the path we had chosen was the right one. With new motivation and a little funding, I knew what I had to do next. My grandfather's legacy wasn't just about inventions, it was about inspiration. We launched the Young Scientists Initiative. Every weekend, we opened the doors of the Institute to children from local schools, especially those with little exposure to science. The first session, about a dozen kids showed up, shy and curious. I saw myself in their eyes, the quiet intelligence, the desire to explore. I showed them WaveWing as they in action, let them operate the microscopes to look at a drop of seawater, and told them the story of my notebook. One little girl named Maya, about 11, with hair that always fell over her face, stayed behind after. She shyly handed me a notepad. Inside were pages filled with drawings and notes about the behavior of seabirds she'd observed at the harbor. Her observations were raw, but full of detail and passion. "This is amazing, Maya," I said, looking her right in the eye. "You have the eye of a true scientist." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with astonishment, as if for the first time someone had truly seen her. "Really?" she whispered. "Really?" I smiled. "And don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise." In that moment, seeing the hope and recognition light up her face, I understood. This was the real legacy. Not the building, not the patents. It was this moment, the moment of igniting a spark in a young mind, knowing that one day, that spark would also shine brightly. 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. The Vance Institute of Oceanography didn't just survive, it thrived. Project WaveWing was a major success, not only powering the entire institute but also selling the surplus back to the local grid, creating a steady stream of income. We received more small grants, and most importantly, we earned the trust and support of the community. The Young Scientists Initiative became a beloved program, and watching kids like Maya confidently present their own projects, I knew we were doing something right. I hadn't spoken to my parents since that day. Occasionally, I'd see their names in financial news or articles about charity galas in Florida, where they had retired early. They belonged to another world, one that no longer had anything to do with me. I didn't hate them, but I didn't miss them either. Their existence within me was just a cold, empty space, a costly lesson in what love should not be. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, an unexpected email appeared in my inbox. It was from a law firm in Seattle, not Mr. Harrison's. The subject line was brief: Request for a meeting from Savannah Vance. My heart skipped a beat. For 2 years, I'd had no contact with Savannah. I braced myself for a new legal battle, another attempt to challenge the will, or some other scheme to cause trouble. I replied cautiously, agreeing to meet her at the Institute the following week. When Savannah arrived, I almost didn't recognize her. Gone were the designer heels and perfectly tailored dresses. She wore simple jeans, a gray sweater, and an old trench coat. Her once golden hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore no makeup. She looked tired, and for the first time in her life, she looked small. She walked into the main hall of the Institute, where I had hung a large portrait of our grandfather, Arthur. She stopped in front of the painting for a long time, her gaze thoughtful. He always knew who I was, Savannah said quietly, her voice hoarse. Even when I didn't, especially when I didn't reply, just waited in silence. Could I have a look around? She asked, her voice hesitant. I want to see what he built for you, and what you've built from it. I could have said no, but looking at the woman standing before me, a total stranger compared to the person I had known, I nodded. I gave her a tour through the main lab, where Tara and her team were analyzing data on giant screens. Through the workshop, where Micah was instructing a group of interns on a new version of WaveWing. Past the wall of honor, where we hung the articles, the small awards, and the photos of the kids from the Young Scientists Initiative. Savannah didn't say much, just observed quietly. Her old air of smugness and judgment was gone. She just looked, and I had the feeling she was really seeing things for the first time. When we got to the community garden behind the Institute, where local families grew vegetables using our sustainable methods, she stopped. A few kids were laughing and chasing each other by the lettuce beds. A mother was showing her son how to make compost. The atmosphere was wholesome and full of life. Savannah turned to me, and I saw her eyes were red. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said, her voice shaking. I don't deserve it. She was quiet for a moment, trying to compose herself. In the last 2 years, I've lost everything. Not the money, but everything else. The friends, the connections. It was all fake, built on the image my parents created for me. When that glamour disappeared, there was nothing left. I just wanted to say, she continued, seeing what you've done here, I get it now. I understand the difference between building an image and building something real. And what you have here, it's real. She didn't cry, but her shoulders trembled. In the months that followed, Savannah started coming to the Institute every weekend. She didn't do big things. She volunteered. She helped us organize documents, water the plants in the garden, and notably, she used her communication skills to help the kids in the Young Scientists Initiative. She taught them how to present their ideas with confidence, how to stand tall, make eye contact, and turn dry data into a compelling story. The kids adored her. One afternoon, after the program had ended, she handed me a binder. I wrote a little handbook on communication skills for shy kids, she said, looking a bit embarrassed. I thought it might be useful. That night, I opened the binder. It was carefully written, detailed, and full of empathy. And for the first time in my life, I saw a version of my sister I could respect. We never talked about the past. Her apology didn't come from her mouth, but from her persistent actions every weekend. And maybe that was enough. We weren't the close sisters people might think of, but in this small corner of the world that my grandfather had dreamed of, we had found a truth of our own. And for me, that was a legacy greater than any ocean I.